So the last words I get to hear my son say is clear to land runway 23.
Welcome, everyone, to Inside the Cockpit. I'm your host, MayCay Beeler, here at Queen City News Plus. Thanks for joining us. Now, those of you who know me know that I'm a pilot of over 40 years and counting. Aviation is my passion. I'm also an FAA safety team member representative. So safety has been very important to me over the years. And today we have a very special guest who is very interested in being a safety advocate for very personal reasons. So he is a pilot expert, a commercial jet pilot, Army veteran, and former Black Hawk pilot, and a speaker, Tim Lilley. Now, beyond his professional experience, Tim is the father of First Officer Sam Lilley, who tragically lost his life in the DCA Midair collision in January of 2025. So Tim says that Sam's passing has reinforced his commitment to aviation safety and advocacy and making sure the necessary changes are made. So an accident like that will never happen again. And we welcome in Tim Lilley. Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be doing media with another pilot. Normally, the person on the other end is trying to figure out a lot of these terms, and you're going to understand a lot more than most of the media will.
Absolutely. And we'll try to put them in layman's terms too. So first of all, how are you doing?
After it's been almost 7 months now, and it's been a hard road, but we're getting there. And, I just can't explain what it's like to lose a child, even an adult child, in an accident like this. But, our hope is that we can get something good out of this.
How do you begin? How does one even cope with something like this? How are you coping?
Well, the company that I work for supported me. They flew my family into DC on a private jet. They sent a care team for us. And so those things helped a lot, but it doesn't bring your child back. Now, here on Earth, I helped Sam learn to fly. But in the next life, he's going to show me how it's done up there. So that kind of gives me hope for the future. I love this life, but this thing of death is gone for me because I know that I'm going to fly with Sam again someday.
Absolutely. So how do you make sense of this accident? There were so many pieces to the puzzle, and there are so many fingers that can be pointed. How do you make sense out of this?
Well, sure. As you know, I flew those exact routes in the 90s, hundreds of times, 2 or 3 times a week for 4 years straight. So I know those routes intimately, and I know pretty much the things that can go wrong and did go wrong. And I knew those right away. And so when I'll tell you, I was sitting in an NTSB brief the day after the accident. I'm in a room with about 200 new orphans and widows and people who lost their children. And the first person to get up and brief was the fire chief. And he's going to tell everybody how the recovery is going. And he says, it's a gruesome event. And there was body parts spread all over the ice. And, half the people in there lost their mind, right? They ran out. Many did. And as we got into the brief, I realized I might be the only person in that room who knew what Class B airspace was and, who had ever flown a Black Hawk helicopter. And so I didn't want to, but I felt a heavy moral obligation to be kind of the technical expert representing the families in this situation. And so from there, just God put some people in our life that were able to make some connections for us. We started talking to legislators. We talked to Secretary Duffy just a few days after the accident. And Secretary Duffy, he doesn't get everything right, but this he did get right. And we sat down with him, and I asked him if he would permanently close Route 4 whenever runway 33 was in use, and if he would commit to modernizing the air traffic control system, and if he would commit to fully manning ATC towers, and if they would work on taking all this data and cross-referencing it and trying to find out where the next accident was going to happen and stop it before it happened. The very next day, he was on the news talking about these same things that we talked about. So I'm going to give him props. He's already been able to get $12.5 billion, and that's a good start to modernize ATC infrastructure. I think we're going to need about 19 billion more, but we're headed down that road. And he did us one better than closing Route 4 when runway 33 was in use. He just went ahead and closed it altogether. For those that don't know, Route 4 is a route that runs along the Potomac River that helicopters could fly at or below 200 feet. But when I flew those routes, we understood you didn't fly that route if somebody was on approach to Tree 3. Somewhere in the culture of the Army, that institutional knowledge was lost. And so that's something we're working on as well.
You know, I know Jennifer Homendy, the chair of the NTSB, you have attended some of those hearings. New information keeps coming out. Some of the early reports indicated that the Black Hawk helicopter was at the wrong altitude, was lower than they should have been.
They were high.
Yeah, right. And from your understanding, Tim, the CRJ that your son was first officer on was where it was supposed to be. It was cleared to land on short approach for runway 33. And both the CRJ and the helicopter were communicating with ATC according to reports. And the Black Hawk did say that they had a visual. They had their eyes on the CRJ, and they confirmed that twice, that they had visual separation, which now means it is their responsibility, not ATC's, to keep their safe distance from the CRJ. But do you think they had their eyes on the wrong aircraft?
Well, 100% visual separation played a giant part in this. So if I've been a professional pilot for about 40 years, about as long as you have. And I, for one, even though I was a helicopter pilot for 37 years, I never once in my life requested visual separation. And I never heard of that happening before this accident. Even when I flew those routes, we never requested visual separation. We waited for the air traffic controller to assign visual separation to us after we had positively identified that aircraft. But through all of the testimony and everything in the docket, I can see that that unit had routinely requested visual separation. And some of the pilots in that unit even admitted to requesting visual separation when they didn't have aircraft in sight.
Oh my gosh.
Which is, I mean, just as crazy to think about, right? So if you look in the Airman's Information Manual in Chapter 4, it says that if a pilot is going to accept visual separation, they have to maintain a constant visual surveillance of the other aircraft and not pass that aircraft until it's no longer a factor. So the air traffic controller expects you, if you lose sight of the aircraft, to call and say, hey, right, I've lost sight. And then they're going to give you a new heading, or they're going to hold you, or they're going to do something. When I flew those routes, we always held at Haines Point if somebody was on approach to 33. And I would say that even if the air traffic controller didn't tell me to hold at Haines Point, I would have known to do that, because there's not enough room at 200 feet between an aircraft on the glide path to land at tree 3 and you're flying. Even if you cleared them, the weight turbulence alone would be a giant hazard. So it's not something that a pilot would do on purpose. But that unit, when they were interviewed, almost every pilot misunderstood those routes. They thought that if they were on the route, on the right altitude, that they would have clearance from the other aircraft, and it's just not so.
So this is a training issue. They weren't taught properly, or is it just a poor culture?
They weren't taught properly. The senior instructor pilot who gave a lot of the testimony at the NTSB briefing clearly misunderstood both visual separation and the routes. And he was the guy that set the standard in that unit. So that was really tough to hear. Now, on the good side, on early in September, I'm going to be giving a class to the instructor pilots and the safety officers in that unit. And we're going to talk about their SMS system, that safety management system. One of the things I saw on the docket was almost every pilot in that unit understood how to make a safety report. None of the pilots in that unit had ever made a safety report. And so if you have a safety management system that people aren't making reports, then that system's broke. Exactly. And so if people were having near misses, nobody ever, thought to do something different, right?
Right, right. Oh, and what about the altitude readout? Do you think the altimeter, I think according to reports, there was some confusion in the helicopter. Maybe they didn't have the right barometric pressure, the right setting. Maybe the altimeter was off. We know altimeters can be off as much as 75 feet.
So right. So
Right? They can be, and it was just such a tiny, narrow vertical separation. So for folks watching this that don't understand about the altimeter and the readout, the ADSB, isn't that is required equipment in that CIFRA or Bravo airspace. Well,
so the helicopter didn't have their ADSB out transmitting, and they
and
did that
so
on
let people know,
purpose.
right? This is the most accurate readout of their position and their
Right.
altitude, and
They
it was
they
turned
had
off.
it was turned off. That whole unit had been not using ADSB out for some time. They were using an exemption that said the Army didn't have to use it in if it was a matter of national security. And so they decided that training flight was a matter of national security, which is just ridiculous, right?
In the
So they
world,
had to
in the
add
busiest airspace in the
it
country, really.
in the most complicated
Yeah.
airspace in the entire country. So crazy to think that that's the way that they did things, but we've got a lot of that changed already. So now, in order for them to fly without ADS-B out
ASB.
off
Mhm.
for the 12th anyway, they have to have permission from their colonel, so the brigade commander. So that would only be if, say, they're flying a national security mission, moving, high-ranking individuals out of harm's way. So they're no longer going to use it, just generally from day to day.
I was wondering about that because in the media we get different reports that these
Yeah.
were the suggestions that the NTSB made, but we weren't sure that Route 4, that helicopter route, was indeed shut down permanently. We get different reports. So, what do you know that maybe the flying public is not sure about? It sounds
So
like you are indeed in a position where your voice is heard and you can make a difference.
it's been heard quite a bit, and well, the Army did shut me down for 6 months, but they finally are listening to me now. Yeah, Route 4 is definitely closed. The only time that Route 4 can be used is if there's an active need for it for like law enforcement. But whenever that happens, runway 33 will be shut down. So that's really good news. The Army's made some changes, and we've got a long way to go with the Army and their changes. But um, the other thing is there's some legislation that's in the works. We're working on getting the Democrats and the Republicans to come together on a combined Rotor Act safety legislation, and if that passes, it's really going to close a lot of loopholes as far as ADS-B out goes, and possibly even mandate ADS-B in, which we've been looking for many years. So that'll be great.
So, what's with all these near misses, like over the past decade, 15,000, that the FAA allegedly never acted on? We tend to have this tombstone mentality that regulations are written in blood. So something horrific like this accident that could have been prevented has to happen before the changes are made. Is this what's going on? Tombstone
So
mentality?
this accident was years in the making, right? And it's like you said, there was 15,000, over 15,000 near proximity events. Even more, there was 85 like real near misses enough where evasive action had to happen, kind of thing. 200 feet of vertical separation, and that's just unacceptable. If you have that kind of data, you have to make a change. So one of the things we asked for early on was a system that actually all that. I don't know if you're familiar with the SIAS, but it's a giant database full of all the information that the aircraft are downloading every day that they fly in and out of there. And so all that data was available to be accessed, but nobody was analyzing it to see what was going on. And so that's one of the things that we're now doing is we're analyzing data a lot more, and the changes have been made already. I know you probably saw that they put out some training for aircraft in the Charleston area, Charleston, South Carolina, about mid-airs. And then also they made some changes in Las Vegas about the way helicopters fly in and out of there. And so, some positive things are happening. We'll never know how many lives are going to get saved because hopefully there's no more accident that we can point to that is similar to this one. Um, but the hope is that we're going to get past this regulation written in blood, and we'll find regulation can be written from data alone or from experience.
Tim, you attended the hearings a couple of weeks ago. The NTSB, Jennifer Homendy, of course, being the chair. She had a comment that she made after the hearings. Let's take a listen.
It's so bureaucratic that nobody can take what is clearly a safety issue and get it up through the offices that should be making the decision to ensure safety in the airspace, or somebody's ignoring them.
Yeah, Tim, what do you think about that? What's your reaction to that?
She's 100% correct. With listening to the testimony, it was painful to listen to. At one point, we heard that the air traffic controllers had asked for changes to the helicopter route chart and have some warnings on there about the choke points. But because they use the wrong terminology, they call them hot spots. And as we know, hot spots are normally found on the airport
on the ground, right?
Airport they were just rejected without sitting back and go, hey, let's just change this name. Let's put this on here properly. This might have saved 67 lives. We don't know for sure. But another thing that happened was that no air traffic controller went for alcohol testing. And as an aviator, that if you're involved
absolutely.
in an incident, that drug and alcohol testing is one of the things you do as soon as everybody who can be saved is saved, right?
Yeah.
Then you secure the accident site and then you go for drug and alcohol testing.
Yes.
No air traffic controller had alcohol testing. They did drug testing about almost 24 hours later.
That's unacceptable.
Unacceptable. Right. And they blamed it on bureaucracy. Apparently the person who was supposed to send them, didn't go through the proper process.
Do you think that the ATC shortage played a role? We know accidents are a chain, all sorts of things that contribute to it. And according to reports, there was one controller working two jobs, both the airplanes and the helicopters. Let me clarify something. The CRJ and the Black Hawk, were they both talking on the same frequency to the tower?
They were not. So the helicopter was on the helicopter only frequency, and the CRJ was on the regular tower frequency. Okay, so we had one controller working both frequencies, so they could both hear what was being said to the other one, but they couldn't hear. Say the CRJ couldn't hear what the Black Hawk said, and the Black Hawk couldn't hear what the CRJ said.
And then there were reports too that maybe in the Black Hawk somebody was keying the mic, pressing the mic, and maybe it was blocked. They didn't hear.
So that is not 100% accurate.
Okay.
The person on the pilot monitoring on the helicopter blocked air traffic control twice because, and my theory is he was just in a real hurry to answer back because the air traffic control there is very, very busy.
Yeah.
And if you wait too long, you're not going to get your turn to talk.
Yeah.
And so I think what happened was he wanted to talk and get his message through so fast that he stepped on the air traffic controller before the air traffic control was done. So it's quite obvious he either didn't understand that the aircraft was circling at 33, or he didn't understand where that aircraft would be if it was circling to 33. In the testimony we heard from the senior instructor pilot that used to be at that unit, that he didn't understand aircraft circled to 33.
Let's talk about the Black Hawk helicopter. So this was an annual required training mission. Is that correct? Yes. And were they wearing night goggles? Do we know?
They were wearing night vision goggles.
They were wearing them. And so doesn't that kind of limit your vision this way anyway?
Yes. So, right. So there's a lot of limitations with night vision goggles, especially when it comes to doing visual separation. So night vision goggles limit your view to 40 degrees.
Wow.
And then, of course, bright lights like city lights really affect your ability to see anything. So if you're looking through night vision goggles, can't tell the difference between a Cessna 172 and a 747. All you're going to see is a light in the distance. And so if you look from Memorial Ridge, where they call traffic in sight, all you're going to see is a line of lights lined up for runway 1. You don't know which one's over Wilson Bridge. You don't know which one's on short final, which one is, 10 miles away. And so they called it for visual separation 6.5 miles away. They had absolutely no chance of being able to maintain visual separation with that aircraft all the way until they passed the airport. And so I think there was a cultural problem where that whole unit was just pre-programmed to automatically request visual separation. And that's what happened. And of course, when they were told again, just moments before impact, they were told again about the CRJ, and they called traffic in sight request visual separation without even taking a minute to look around and see that aircraft. In the cockpit voice recorder, we don't see any discussion about the traffic at all. And so that tells me that those two pilots were not discussing traffic.
So, Tim, let me ask you, and I'll explain this for our non-pilot viewers. Were they respecting sterile cockpit? So sterile cockpit is when you're below 10,000 feet, critical phase of flight, takeoff or landing. All the conversation has to be related to the flight. We can't talk about we're going to go to Cracker Barrel for dinner. We're talking about the flight. Were you able to listen to the cockpit voice recorder? Was there any unnecessary conversation that you know of?
I didn't get to listen to either cockpit voice recorders. So the last words I get to hear my son say is clear to land runway 23. But I was able to read the transcripts from both cockpit voice recorders. And I'm also proud to say that I was pulled aside by more than one person that heard the cockpit voice recorder of the CRJ that told me Sam was a professional throughout that flight from takeoff to landing. So that made me really proud. But the transcripts that I read from the U.S. Army helicopter, they were respecting, at least on the routes, they were respecting all the protocols. As far as sterile cockpit is concerned, I will tell you that one of the pilots in there was taking a check ride and, was having a lot of difficulties. And so what we call that is that person had become behind the aircraft. So the aircraft was flying down Route 4, and, their mind was still probably back at Cabin John. So that really was part of the incident, because the instructor pilot understood that they weren't exactly in the right place and they weren't exactly in the right altitude. And he had instructed her to come to turn left in 6 seconds before impact, and yet no turn was made.
And we know, it's just so upsetting. We know the instructor pilot's responsible.
The instructor pilot is ultimately responsible. He's the PIC. So
that's right.
From everything I've read about him and what my understanding about him, he was a really good pilot. And, even good pilots. It's only by the grace of God that I haven't caused anybody to be killed in the 12,000 hours that I've flown airplanes and helicopters. I've made a lot of mistakes.
Of course.
But this was a lot of mistakes that all lined up, and they all lined up in a terrible, tragic way.
What is the biggest lesson? Not that you need to learn a lesson, but what is the biggest lesson to come out of this?
I think the lesson is to not become complacent. So one of the things I learned early on about the unit, the 12th, is that they considered flying those routes low risk because they've done it so many times. And so they had done it so many times, but they didn't realize they were doing it wrong so many times. And so they become complacent, and they didn't really take the time to learn the proper way to fly. And so, like, for instance, in the hearings, they spent half a day talking about altimeter error. But you and I know that about day 10 of flight school, we learned about altimeter error, and we knew that that altimeter just wasn't going to be accurate under all circumstances, barometric altimeter. Yet the radar altimeter said 270 feet, 278 feet, pretty much straight and level right until impact. And the other thing is, we have to make flying our priority when we're in the cockpit. Whatever was distracting them, I do not know, but nobody in that Black Hawk cockpit even flinched or said anything before impact. So they didn't know they were going to hit that airplane until they hit that airplane. Jonathan, and who was the captain of the CRJ, and Sam, who was the first officer, both had reactions 1 second before impact. And as you know, when you have a CRJ on short final at VREF +5, 1 second's not enough time to make that aircraft turn. And so they began a go around. They made a near full scale deflection. I'm not sure if they moved the thrust levers or not. I haven't found any evidence one way or the other there, but they did make a near full scale deflection, but it was too late. You can't turn a CRJ that fast that's in the landing configuration.
So do you think the pilots in the helicopter, that their readout on their altimeter was wrong and they thought they were at the right altitude? Or do you think they were
I believe
lax?
there's a good chance that they thought they were at 200 feet
Yeah.
MSL,
Yeah.
but these routes are not for beginners. And so you have to go beyond. They talked a lot about what the air training manual standard, which is plus or minus 100 feet in the hearings, but the
Right.
the ATM standards don't apply on these routes.
Right. Well, they should.
That 200. Well, what I'm saying is that's not strict enough.
Exactly. Exactly.
You cannot go above 200 feet on that route, and you shouldn't have. They shouldn't have even been on that portion of the route at all during approaches to 3-3. But if you were going to be on that, the only chance you have to survive it is to be exactly where you're supposed to be, and that's right on the east bank of the river, which they were more. They were about a third of the way toward the middle, and then also to be at or below 200.
Let me ask you this, Tim. Don't answer it if you don't feel comfortable, because we have covered this accident all these months. President Trump made a comment right after the accident that seemed to think that a DEI hire was to blame, either in the tower or in the cockpits. Do you have any comment to make about that?
I would rather not go there.
Okay, that's fine. I understand that. Yeah, no.
I think both of the pilots in that aircraft were good, honorable people serving their country. They
Absolutely.
had tremendously bad last few minutes of their life.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Tell us about Sam, and what would Sam want us to know?
Well, Sam, he well, for instance, he went to college as a marketing major, and so aviation. I became a big into aviation, as a teenager. Sam came a little bit later, so he was a marketing major, and when he graduated, he worked in marketing for about a month, and he called me and said, "Dad, marketing is not for me." And I said, "Okay, you knucklehead, we should have had this conversation 4 years ago." But he said, "I want to be a pilot like you." And so, after I tried to talk him into tell him all the things that could go wrong with that plan, he started doing his introductory flights. And once he did that, he pursued it vigorously. And in just a few short years, even with COVID slowing him down, he was able to get to the cockpit of a CRJ, which is amazing. Earlier years back, that's just not heard of. But his timing was on, and he just pursued it vigorously. And the next thing you know, he was flying a CRJ, and he was engaged to be married. We really love Lydia, who we now consider our daughter-in-law. But I was super excited to see where that family was going to go. That just didn't happen, but it's a shame. It's a real shame that his life got cut short. And we miss him every day. I'm still not quite to the point where I can sleep through the night, but I think we're getting there. But I'll tell you, Sam would be proud that we have pursued aviation safety in his name, because his death is not for just for nothing.
We're going to wrap this up. Last words. How do you move forward from this? And closing it out, what would Sam want us to know?
Well, Sam wants us to know, he wants the flying public to know that flying on airlines and PSA is still one of the very safest ways to travel. But we're going to make it even safer. And how we're going to move forward is we're going to be there to help get that last $19 billion. And we're going to be there to help pass the Motor Safety Act. And we're going to be there working with the Army to change some of the cultural issues that they have. And we're going to try to get the proficiency level of Army pilots back to where it was when I was flying. I think part of the problem for them is that they're just not getting the assets to fly regularly, and we want to see that change.
Well, Tim, Lilley, we are so grateful for your time, and we are so sorry, but there's no question you are where you are supposed to be.
I appreciate that, and thank you for having me, give me a chance to tell the story.
Good luck. Keep at it.
Thank
you so much. And thank you all for joining us for this edition of Inside the Cockpit. I'm your host, MayCay Beeler with Queen City News Plus. We'll see you next time.
Queen City News Plus. Just search Queen City News on your smart TV's app store.